Boldwood presents The Ramage Hawk, written by John Pilkington and read by Simon Mattox. Prologue. John Tyrrell was dying. The other prisoners in the twopenny ward, as close to the hole as a man may be, yet still count himself a cut above its wretched, groaning inmates, began to avoid him, stepping around what had become Tyrrell's section of the wall. Jail fever. They knew the signs. And the ragged, shivering, foul-smelling man who'd once called himself Master Tyrrell, student of St. John's, Cambridge, knew them too. In this first week of August, in the year 1590, when the heat and stench inside the Wood Street counter, the debtors' prison nearest St. Paul's, had become all but unbearable, a new face appeared in the twopenny ward. Simon Pepper was the name he gave. Within hours, for some reason none could fathom, he had befriended John Tyrrell, brought him a tarred leather mug of sack and a dish of peas, and watched him drink greedily, though he could not swallow the food. When Tyrrell had drained the last of the poor, watered sack, he spoke in a voice choked with phlegm and weak from starvation. "Why have you done this for me?" His filmy eyes searched the dark-bearded face, seeing a man who looked somewhat well-fed and a little too well-dressed to be clapped up in the counter. "I'm a friend of your catamite, Will Pygott," Pepper answered. Tyrrell's whole body jerked. "You've seen him?" Pepper wore a sombre look. "He's dead." Tyrrell gave a cough. "When?" Though Pepper still looked concerned, he seemed to be hiding a smile, as if unable to believe that it was going to be this easy. He leaned a little closer. "I killed him." Tyrrell began shaking. "No one knows," Pepper told him quietly. "To all appearances he was drunk and fell down the Blackfriars stairs, breaking his empty head. The verdict will be mischance, not murder." "You spoke with him," Tyrrell began hoarsely. "So you know something, or you wouldn't be here." "Stop." Pepper's voice, though soft, bore the unmistakable note of authority. "I will lay the tale before you." Tyrrell sank back against the crumbling mortar. "It begins with you," Pepper told him, and shook his head sadly. "What dumps you put your poor mother in, John Tyrrell. A man of good family, who went to the university. Such bright hopes she had for you. You might have come home to Salisbury, married well and given her grandchildren. Instead, you repay her by abandoning your studies and forsaking the company of women for the rough bodies of boys, men like Will Pygott, dice player and as crooked a purser as ever sailed out of harbour, or sailed into harbour, as he did 3 years back, on the 26th of June, 1587, when the whole of Plymouth turned out in celebration to see Drake bring the San Felipe into port." Pepper stopped for a moment. "You and Pygott," he sneered. "Two lusty lads who can't keep their hands off each other. Lying spent in some waterfront tavern, after you've foined each other raw, you fall to fanciful talk, as all lovers do. And Pygott's a bold one. He tells you of the riches aboard the San Felipe, that glorious treasure ship Drake has plucked from the Spanish. The jewels, plate and bullion, the chests of gold double ducats. That amount, it's said, to more than 100,000 English pounds. And more, he tells you how he has an arm lock on one of the guards who fears for his post, and how he may bribe another, if only someone he can trust will dispatch a third. Then you and he may come at a portion of the San Felipe's riches, and, nailed up in a barrel, which may be rolled down the gangplank in broad daylight while the business of the port goes forth about it, you and he may make away with your portion, and dividing it up into panniers, with pack-horses ready, you may set forth from Devon, never to return, and Arcadia awaits you." Tyrrell turned a haggard face towards Simon Pepper, but the other refused to meet his gaze. "Your scheme fadged well, did it not?" he said. "By the time the theft was discovered, you were gone. And besides, no man could vouch for certain what had happened. A guard knocked on the head, another pinned from behind, his head covered so that he saw no one. If any man wondered at the timely disappearance of one of Sir Francis's pursers, none seems to have given voice to his suspicion." Pepper turned slightly and gave Tyrrell an admiring look. "It was a wondrous crime, John. Would that you'd had the sense to take ship for some other land." A cry that was almost a yelp came from Tyrrell's lips. "I had a plan. Disguises, all was ready," he croaked. "In Italy we could have lived like lords for the rest of our days. Why wait? It was not folly, but madness." He raised a shaking hand to his face. "But Will said he was known to too many seamen. We would be discovered." He shook his head. "Why did I let him rule me?" Pepper laid a comforting hand on his arm. "He was all to you, was he not?" Tears rolled from Tyrrell's eyes. Then he frowned suddenly. "And you killed him?" "He betrayed you," Pepper answered smoothly. "Why did he not come with the money he promised? You and he have a fortune hidden away." Tyrrell sniffed. "We vowed we would not touch it until the matter was long past," he mumbled. "When it was safe we would recover it and—" He swung his head towards Pepper. "If he'd told you where it was, you wouldn't have come here." Pepper gave a bland smile, as one who is glad to come to the nub of things at last. "Now you see your course. Rather, you see the choice, and it is but a simple one. Tell me where it is, and you walk free of the counter. Tell me nothing, I'll leave you to die here. Because nobody knows you are here, John Tyrrell. No one will pay your debts, for Pygott disowned you. He was ready to leave for Wiltshire and take up your prize." Tyrrell started. "And I'm the only one who knows where it is." "I said, you may walk out of here," Pepper went on. "In the morning I'll pay the keepers what they've asked, and one will escort us both to Silver Street. You have remembered an old friend who will settle your debts. Once we are there, the keeper will turn aside for a moment, as I have paid him to, and we will make our escape through Cripplegate. In St. Giles Without, we will go to a house I know where we can rest and make ready for our journey." Tyrrell's senses were reeling. It was no bluff. People did indeed pay the keepers to take them out sometimes. If you had the money, you could get anything in the counter. He swallowed, wincing at the pain in his swollen throat. "A physician," he muttered. "I need physic." "You'll have it," Pepper answered. "Then once you're fit to travel, we go to Wiltshire and recover the prize, which we divide in two. Then we part forever. Agreed?" Tyrrell gave a long sigh. He could rest now. In the morning, he coughed, then nodded feebly. Pepper smiled, a real smile now, of mingled pleasure, anticipation, even friendliness. "Good John Tyrrell," he murmured. "Put yourself in my hands, and you will be free." But Tyrrell's eyes were already closing, and his head fell forward. It was the last real sleep he would know. 2 days later, Simon Pepper left a semi-derelict tenement in St. Giles and made his way round the walls towards Holborn Bridge. With him was a stout, very muscular man wearing a hood, who carried their belongings in a shoulder pack. He it was, playing at first the unlikely part of the physician, who had laid hold of the broken body of John Tyrrell the night before and wrung the last scrap of information from his sorry, wasted frame before dispatching him with a single blow to the skull. By the end, Tyrrell had been more than ready to spill all he knew. In the hands of such an inquisitor, he begged to tell more, anything that would bring oblivion and an end to his suffering. The heavy man wore no expression. His features had long since lost the ability to register emotion. But his master breathed the sweet air of the fields west of the city, felt the morning sun on his back, and smiled to himself. All his life he had waited for an opportunity like the one which now lay before him, and the ease with which it had fallen into his lap, after a chance talk with a maudlin sailor in a Plymouth alehouse, made him want to laugh aloud. An old, half-forgotten air from his boyhood drifted into his mind, and he began to whistle it softly. To the irritation of his burly servant, he was still whistling it at dinner-time, when the two men, now mounted, broke their journey at Uxbridge on the West Road. It was their first stop on the way to distant Wiltshire and the home of John Tyrrell's aunt, a half-mad, painted spinster in her middle years, who dressed like a young maid and still waited for a handsome gallant to wed her. She had no idea at all of the existence of the treasure from the San Felipe, which had lain hidden in her house for the past 3 years. Chapter 1. The harvesters, coming home from the hayfields in a body, paused at the crossroads as a tall rider on a bright sorrel horse approached them from the north. As he reined in, they saw he bore a hooded hawk on his wrist. Their leader, John Cardmaker, the Hayward, half raised a hand in greeting. Falconers were common enough on the downs, especially about the village of East Everley, where the Queen's own falconer, Sir Ralph Sadler, had built the fine manor house and trained his hawks until his sad death 3 years back, though happily his son Henry carried on the tradition. Tradition was everything here, on the hills that gave on to Salisbury Plain, stretching away to the southwest. As far as most people were concerned, life in East Wiltshire had changed little since Doomsday, and that, most said, was how it should be. The tall rider, russet-bearded with grey, far-seeing eyes, gazed down upon the group of men and nodded in return. "Looks like you've done a hard day's work," he smiled. "That we have, master," Cardmaker answered. "Hay harvest is a late one this year." He was a little man with an officious manner that did not sit well with his brawny arms and deeply sun-tanned face. "Are you seeking the manor of Everley?" Thomas the falconer, who had ridden 20 miles from his West Berkshire home since noon, shook his head. "I'm seeking the manor of Chilbourne, the seat of Sir Giles Buckeridge. Can you point me toward it?" There was a snort from one of the harvesters. 1 or 2 others shrugged. It was left to Cardmaker to act as spokesman. "It's no distance for one who's mounted," he said, a little stiffly. He pointed eastwards to the small stone church which stood back from the crossroads. "Past the church, follow the path downhill to the river, then a mile downstream you'll see Chilbourne beyond a clump of beech." Thomas murmured his thanks. As he did so, the fine hawk on his wrist, which had been motionless as a statue, shifted slightly, looking as if she were about to bait. Instinctively, Thomas took the reins in his teeth, leaving his right hand free to stroke the bird, all the while talking softly under his breath. She quietened at once. The village men watched in silence. Used to falconers here on the downs, nevertheless they seldom saw one who had such a born way with birds. With horses too, perhaps, for the sleek sorrel gelding, in which many might have noted a choleric temperament, seemed content to stand patiently until Thomas took the reins up again and made ready to ride. "I'm obliged, master," he said, and allowed his eyes to settle on Cardmaker's plain features. "Who am I addressing?" Cardmaker gave his name and his station, then clearly felt it was his right to ask the other man his business. "Thomas Finbow, falconer to Sir Robert Vicary at the manor of Petbury," Thomas told him. He gave a wry smile. "I'm but a hired man like yourselves, who's been loaned to Sir Giles, like the bird here." The men relaxed a little now. 1 or 2 even smiled back. "You'll have your work cut out then, maester," one volunteered. "There used to be more than 80 servants at Chilbourne. Now there's barely 20. Thomas raised an eyebrow. Cardmaker, clearly a man who disliked gossip, showed his disapproval. But another spoke up. "And if what village folk here be true, none of them's been paid in months." Cardmaker rounded on the man, who looked away and spat into the dry ditch beside the road. But when he glanced back at Thomas, he saw the falconer regarding him with a look of understanding. He too, Cardmaker realised, was not given to idle talk. "Then I'd best look to my own business," Thomas said. He gave the reins a twitch and half-turned the gelding. But before taking his leave, he pointed with his chin towards the thatched roofs of the village, dark against the sunset. "At least tell me there's an inn here, where a man might find a welcome," he said. The Hayward relaxed somewhat. "There is, Master Finbow," he replied. "The White Hound, the largest house there where the ground rises." Thomas nodded. "Then I shall come in when I may, and buy you a mug for your information," he said. He clicked his tongue, touched his boot heels to the gelding's flanks, and rode off in the direction he'd been given. The harvesters watched him disappear, then shouldered their hooks and pitchforks and resumed their trudge homewards, wondering what Sir Robert Vicary, whoever he was doing, loaning a falconer of that calibre to the impoverished, debt-ridden, indeed rather ridiculous Sir Giles Buckeridge, whose very name had become a byword for failure on the Everley Downs. For Thomas, it was a less than auspicious end to his journey, and one that threatened to confirm his worst fears. It was only a matter of days since Sir Robert, in one of his rare fits of generosity, had ordered him to travel to Chilbourne to aid his old hunting friend, though admitting that he'd not set eyes on him for years. Thomas, who had more than enough work on his hands this summer, hid his displeasure, merely asking what his master wished him to do for Sir Giles. When the reply came that he was to instruct Sir Giles's 19-year-old ward, a bookish lad named Gervase Lambert, in the arts of falconry, his heart sank. "Is there no one there who might perform such a task, Sir Robert?" he had muttered, standing beside the falcon's mews with a frisky young hawk on his arm, both of them eager to be out on the downs. Sir Robert had been somewhat evasive that morning. "Sir Giles's own falconers have left his service, I hear," he answered, gazing into the distance. "Besides, the task requires a man of sympathy and patience, like yourself." Refusing to rise to the obvious flattery, Thomas persisted. "Is the young gentleman then such an unwilling pupil?" he asked, unable to avoid the depressing thought that someone who had not mastered the basic tenets of falconry by the age of 19 could hardly be enamoured of the sport at best. At worst, he might be utterly unsuited to it. "You choose to ignore, as is your custom, Thomas, when it suits you, that Chilbourne lives in one of the finest parts of England for falconry," Sir Robert told him. "You must make the best of your stay. See now, surely you might trap a couple of passage hawks before the September migration?" Thomas nodded. "With luck, that I may, sir," he answered. "Then the matter's settled." Sir Robert, short on patience as usual, turned to take his leave. "I have sent word to Sir Giles that you will arrive a week before Lammas Day. You may ride Cobb, the new gelding." Thomas inclined his head, surprised. Cobb was a fine horse. "And," Sir Robert looked away, "take Tamora with you." Tamora was one of his master's best falcons, a princess of a bird and a favourite with everyone at Petbury. Why was his master being so generous? Thomas opened his mouth, then closed it. He sensed he was being softened up for the worst. "There's one other matter," Sir Robert said, rather too briskly. "Sir Giles has need of someone to tame one of his birds, someone highly skilled like yourself." Thomas understood. "A Ramage hawk." Sir Robert sniffed. "A young hawk, it's true," he murmured. "Taken rather late in the season, perhaps?" Thomas nodded grimly. Ramage hawks that had been allowed to fly wild for some months were notoriously difficult to reclaim, let alone train for the sport. How many days had he spent since his youth crashing about in the bushes, trying to recover such a bird that hopped from branch to branch just outside his grasp and seemed to mock him with every step he took. "I see the picture, Sir Robert," he said. His master looked him in the eye at last, not without amusement. "Good," he replied. "I will commend you to Sir Giles's service until September. The Petbury men must manage without you." He lifted a purse from his belt and held it out. "This should last for the duration. If you are in dire need, you may send word to me for further payment." In dire need? Thomas had taken the purse, a number of questions forming in his mind, but at once his master had stalked off towards the house. A little too quickly, Thomas thought. Now he began to understand why. Sir Robert was helping out a country knight like himself, one who had nothing like his station or influence, and, it seemed, nothing approaching his wealth, if indeed he had much wealth at all. From the moment he dismounted in the weed-choked stable-yard and no groom came out to take his horse, he knew his stay here would be a difficult one. Chilbourne, he saw, had once been a rather grand house, well built in the local manner of grey stone, infilled with knapped flint. But in recent years it had been allowed to decay. One of the outer gates hung off its hinges, while the park beyond was untended. The only sign of habitation, apart from smoke from the kitchen chimney, was a small horse-herd in a rudely fenced paddock. From the manor itself came no sound. Thomas placed the falcon on a stump beside the door, then led Cobb into the stable, where he received a greater shock. From the gloom within came a stifled shriek and a rustling sound. Peering about, he saw two pale figures in the corner, half hidden in a pile of straw. "Who's there?" he asked, feeling rather foolish, for he could guess what was afoot. There was a silence, then a male voice called, "Who's asking?" "Thomas, falconer to Sir Robert Vicary, come to serve Sir Giles," he answered, and waited. There was more muttering, until finally a heavy-set man with long, nut-brown hair and a thick beard stepped out of the straw and came forward. With one hand he wiped his sweaty face, while the other held up his grimy-looking breeches. He was naked to the waist, with a crow's nest of dark hair on his chest. "I'm Judge Chalkhill," the man mumbled. "Slaughterman." Thomas, aware now of the weariness in his limbs, gazed at him without expression. "Is there no one to look after my horse?" he inquired. "I've ridden the best part of 20 miles. Judd Chalkhill looked both Thomas and the horse up and down. "I reckon I better do it, seeing as there's no one else." Thomas looked past the heavy frame of the slaughterman to the crouching figure beyond. He had no wish to start by making enemies. "I ask pardon for startling you," he said. "It's no business of mine what a man does in the stable after sunset." But Chalkhill merely scowled. "Right enough it's not. And what business do a falconer have here anyways?" Thomas made no reply, until the silence was broken by the sound of more rustling. Finally, a female form emerged from the straw pile in the corner. Thomas saw a plain, fair-haired woman in her mid-20s, wearing a soiled shift. Far from displaying any embarrassment, she gazed at him with frank curiosity. "It's him as come to teach Master Gervase," the woman said. "Don't you remember nothing?" Chalkhill looked less sure of himself. "No one in that house tells me nothing," he said. Thomas raised an eyebrow and held forth the reins. After a moment, having made sure his breeches weren't about to take leave of his waist, the slaughterman took them from him. "I didn't mean no disrespect," he muttered. Thomas nodded. "I ask you to take good care of Cobb. He's a favourite of my master's." When the man grunted his acquiescence, Thomas added, "Is your master at home?" Before Chalkhill could answer, the woman spoke. "I'll take you inside, Falconer. I guess Master Oakes shall receive you. He's butler to Sir Giles." Thomas smiled his thanks, and the woman met his gaze with a sudden flush of awkwardness. She began to speak quickly, as if now embarrassed at the manner of their introduction. "I'm Nan Greenwood,
"Washerwoman, we was expecting you yesternight, only Master Oak said it could be today, and he's never wrong about nothing. You'll likely stay in the groom's loft above here. No one's used it since Ned Tree skipped off with the best harness—" She clapped a hand to her mouth abruptly, so like a child that Thomas wanted to laugh. But Chalkhill spoke up in irritation.
"Lord, stop your great mouth, Nan," he growled. "You can no more hold your tongue than a ram can shave his horns."
He looked askance at Thomas.
"That's not a good place, this," he said. "There's no money for wages, nor barely enough to feed household, nor even the beasts. I killed the last breeding bull for flesh. It's mutton for supper, when there's any meat at all."
He brightened suddenly.
"Here, you'm a falconer. You can hunt for the pot, can't you? Partridge, rail. Oh, few pigeons would go down fine."
Thomas nodded and turned away. "Mayhap I can help," he answered. "For now, all I want is a mug and a bite of supper and somewhere to lay my head." Nan Greenwood had moved to the straw in the corner and found a plain kirtle which she quickly pulled over her head. Straightening herself as best she could, she retrieved a pair of old walking shoes, pulled them on, and stepped forward to show that she was ready. Leaving Judd Chalkhill to look after Cobb, who seemed to accept his fate with indifference, Thomas followed her outside. The mighty Tamora, hearing him approach under her hood, stiffened and half raised her wings. Nan stared.
"Jesu! Be that an eagle?"
Thomas stooped to take the falcon onto his gauntlet. "If she was, she'd be a mite bigger," he replied. "Is there somewhere quiet I can set her for the night?" With a nod, Nan led him away from the stables, round a crumbling wall, and pointed to a low, open-fronted hut made of willow hurdles.
"That's where falconers used to keep their hawks," she said, "before they up and left. There's only one bird there now. 'Twas a gift to Master from Henry Sadler up at Everley Manor. Judd's been giving her water and scraps. He's not the skill to fly her. No one has."
She waited while Thomas walked softly towards the weathering, peered into the darkness within, and saw the Ramage hawk. He stopped dead. The young bird seemed to have been waiting for him. Still in her first year's plumage, she shifted on her perch, caught his eye, and held it. Thomas gazed back, seeing at once the task that lay ahead. He was known as a friend to beasts, but the Ramage hawk stared back at him unflinchingly, the challenge plain in her baleful gaze. "Tame me if you can." With a sigh, Thomas looked away, noting that at least the bird was tethered properly and had a bowl of water nearby. Outside the weathering he found another perch and settled Tamora so that she and the Ramage hawk would be separated. Then he walked back to where Nan was waiting. "I'm ready," he said. Sir Giles Buckeridge, for all his shortcomings, which seemed to multiply in Thomas's mind with every minute he had so far spent at Chilbourne, was, it seemed, not a man who stood on ceremony. Perhaps one in his circumstances had found it easier to dispense with many of the formalities of his rank and status. For in a very few minutes Thomas found himself, still in his dusty riding clothes, being shown into the great chamber where the family were at their supper. Sir Giles himself, a tall, thin-faced man in a duck-green doublet, rose from the high table at once and called out,
"Falconer, come forward, pray. We shan't bite."
The chatter at the top table, which seemed to be occupied mostly by ladies, ceased momentarily as, feeling very self-conscious, Thomas approached, then stopped and made his bow before the company. There was a stifled gasp from a young girl to his left.
"By the Lord, but he's handsome," she whispered,
loudly enough to be heard in the kitchens. Sir Giles, wearing a pained look, swung his head in the girl's direction.
"Hold your foolish tongue, Margaret."
The child, for she was barely a dozen years old, ducked her head, stifling a giggle. Her neighbour, an older girl in a faded sky-blue gown, smiled to herself.
"Master Finbow, you are welcome," boomed Sir Giles. "How is my dear friend Sir Robert?"
"He's well, thank you, sir," Thomas answered. "He sends his warmest greetings, and commends me to your service."
"Splendid! We will have work a-plenty for you, make no mistake. Sir Giles paused, clearly feeling that introductions were necessary. Not without pride, he presented his family one by one. Thomas, tired and aching from his journey, bowed to each in turn, making a mental note of their features. For the Buckeridges had 3 girls, and he had no desire, in the days ahead, to get one of their names wrong. With Lady Catherine, an elegant though painfully thin woman with prematurely grey hair, there could hardly be any mistake. Her face was lined, her mouth drawn down at the corners, though Thomas guessed she was still less than 40 years old. She nodded to him in a disinterested manner. The doings of falconers, he sensed, ranked somewhat low on her list of concerns. Then came the daughters. Margaret, the youngest, a pretty, lively child in a plain, old-fashioned hood. Emma, the one in the blue gown, rather too knowing for one of 14 or 15 years. And finally Jane, the eldest at perhaps 18 years, who was not merely pretty, but quite simply beautiful. This, Thomas guessed, was what the girl's mother had once looked like, before childbearing, financial strain, and the cares of running such a household had taken their toll. Every inch the chaste and dutiful daughter, Jane smiled modestly at him, then lowered her blue eyes at once and gazed down at the table. There was another at the table, a young man in a dusty pink doublet, with delicate features and a thin, neatly trimmed beard. Then he remembered it was Sir Giles's ward, his pupil. "Master Lambert," Sir Giles announced, "behold your tutor." Thomas met the young man's soft brown eyes, reading neither ill will nor friendliness in his gaze, rather boredom. Gervase Lambert, he saw, was being pushed into learning the art of falconry, perhaps in the hope that it would make a hawking man of him, which Thomas feared was something he would never be. As if to confirm his impression, Margaret Buckeridge called out suddenly, "Now see, father, how we have all grown serious again. Cannot Gervase play for us?" There were murmurs of agreement, and Lady Catherine spoke quietly into her husband's ear. Clearly used to being overruled, Sir Giles gave a nod, then turned back towards Thomas. "We will speak tomorrow, Falconer," he called. "The cook will give you a supper, and no doubt someone will show you where you may lodge." He gestured vaguely, and Thomas, highly relieved to be dismissed, made his bow and retreated at once to the far door. As he went out, he glanced back to see Gervase Lambert seating himself on a stool some distance from the table. In his hands was an instrument of some kind. As Thomas gained the stone-flagged passage outside, the strains of a lute, played skilfully enough, rose to fill the great chamber, which he realized suddenly had been quite empty of attendants. He found them in the kitchen, as disgruntled a bunch of house servants as he had met anywhere. Nan was not among them, nor was Judd Chalkhill. Their domain was not the great house, but the outbuildings. As he stepped into the wide room, warm from the dying fire, where the remains of a roasted sheep still hung, he looked about at the faces which turned towards him, and met a wall of blank stares. Finally, a balding man with strands of blonde hair about his cheeks roused himself from a joint stool in the chimney corner and announced himself as the usher, Richard Hawkes. "There's a pottage of peas and barley for you, and a mug of small beer," he said, with a jerk of his head. "That's more than some have had this night." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Will you not have the leftovers, and the company leaves the chamber?" he inquired. Hawkes, who clearly disliked Thomas's tone, frowned. But a big man in a dirty apron, who'd been leaning over a cluttered table in the middle of the room, gave a loud snort. "That we will, such as they are, but they must serve for tomorrow's breakfast and dinner too." His voice rose. "And I'm to make panniers for the harvesters in the fields, and find enough flour to bake pies, and put out scraps for the dogs, and spare us your whining, Master Cliff." A reedy voice broke up from the far wall. Thomas saw an elderly man in a good but old-fashioned suit of dark blue, watching him steadily. After a moment,
The man got up from his bench and came forward, dragging one leg in clumsy fashion. Indeed, the entire left side of his body seemed out of harmony with the right, for the arm too hung limply at his side. "I'm Redmond Oakes, butler to Sir Giles," he said. "And you are the falconer." Thomas nodded and gave his name. Seeking for some way to ease the tension, he thought of Judd Chalkhill's words and added, "Mayhap I can bring in some game to help fill the pot, Master Oakes. Partridges, pheasants, snipe, perhaps." There was a stirring in the room. Cliff, the cook, frowned at Thomas, but there was a gleam in his eye.
"Could you bring down a few quail?"
Thomas shrugged. "If there are any about." Hawkes spoke up from his corner.
"A great bustard would feed us all for a day or two."
He was smiling a very thin smile. Thomas saw the malice in his eyes and found himself on the alert. "I haven't seen one of those for a good while," he answered in a conversational tone. "Mayhap they're more common hereabouts."
"You may find them, if you venture out onto the plain," Hawkes told him, "though they run fast. Can you handle a crossbow, falconer?"
Thomas shook his head and looked away. But Cliff, he sensed, was warming to him.
"You're to teach Sir Giles's ward how to fly a falcon, is not so?" he asked.
Before Thomas could reply, he went on,
"I've heard how two goodly hawks may act as one, and so bring down a bird far bigger than themselves, even a bustard. What say you to that?"
Thomas blinked. The great bustard, the biggest bird in England, rare now, but still found on the downlands. It was bigger than the turkeys of the Americas he'd heard about. A bird with a 6-foot wingspan that could weigh more than 30 pounds. Did the fellow really think it was fair game for falconing? He shook his head. "I'll see what I can do." Cliff nodded in a deliberate sort of way, picked up a mug from the table, drained it in one, then gave a loud belch. The other men looked away. Only then did Thomas realise that the cook was drunk. Redmond Oakes had been observing Thomas as if to get the measure of his man. Now he addressed him in a kinder tone than before. "You're weary from your journey," he said. "Take your supper, then I'll find a serving man. We still had a few of them somewhere last time I counted, to show you where you're to sleep." Thomas favoured the elderly butler with a grateful smile, and though he already knew the way back to the stables and the groom's empty loft, he kept silent and nodded his thanks. "Tomorrow, then." From the chimney corner, Hawkes watched him, without blinking. Chapter 2. Thomas woke at dawn, roused himself from his straw pallet in the bare stable loft, and, as was his custom, went out at once to exercise the falcon. The Ramage hawk would have to wait. It was a fair morning with the promise of another warm day. As he left the outer park of Chilbourne and climbed the gentle slopes above the River Bourne, a shallow chalk stream fringed with gentian and yellow wort, the sweet air of the downs filled his lungs. Rabbits scampered away, while larks and plovers called to each other above his head. Tamora turned under her hood. "Soon enough, my lady," he said, and stroked her long wing feathers. The bird responded by a twitch of her head. There was not a tree in sight. Ahead of him, fields of hay and corn stretched into the distance, before giving on to the open plain where he could make out tiny dots that he knew were grazing sheep. The hayfields, mostly cut down to stubble now, lay in long strips, divided by no more than a line of chalk here and there. Most of the crop, he guessed, was held by the village folk, but some no doubt belonged to Sir Giles or to Everley Manor. He followed a narrow path westwards, still climbing. Ahead, and to his right, the roofs of East Everley village appeared, caught in the first rays of the rising sun. No doubt the harvesters would soon be moving out. He loosed the thongs and slipped Tamora's hood from her head. As he did so, a movement caught his eye some distance away, amid a field of uncut hay. Tamora, of course, saw it too, and tensed on his gauntlet. "Easy," he murmured, keeping a firm hold of the leash looped between his second and third fingers. He stared. A thin haze lay above the hay crop, diffusing the early morning light. Then his eyes narrowed, for there could be no mistake. Someone was moving through the hayfield, parallel to the path, bending low, trying to keep out of sight. Thomas took a few paces forward until he was barely a dozen yards from the mysterious figure, then halted and called out cheerfully, "Good morning. I hope I did not startle you." There was a short silence. Then a man in a rough brown jerkin raised himself slowly from the hay and stood up, looking decidedly sheepish.
"Morning to you,"
he called back, after a pause. He had something in his hand, which he seemed to be trying to conceal. Thomas heard it drop softly into the hay at his feet. "You're early for the harvesting?" Thomas said, feeling inclined to smile. "Where are all the others?" The man shrugged and looked away. Then, as if tired of the game, he walked through the hay until he stood on the path before Thomas. He was a man of the outdoors, tanned and fit-looking, with a reddish-brown beard and sun-bleached hair. And now Thomas saw the look in his eye, one of mingled defiance and amusement.
"A fine bird,"
the man said, with a nod towards the falcon. Thomas nodded, meeting the other's eye. "You'll forgive my fancy, only I thought you had a boundary marker in your hands, back there in the hay crop." The man stared back without expression.
"Did you so?"
"I did," Thomas nodded. "I seem to recall such a thing happened on the West Berkshire Downs, where I come from. A fellow was caught moving the boundary posts by night. On the lammas strips, that is, the 10th of the crop due to his master. If you move the markers a few inches at a time, no one notices, do they? Only the outcome was, his master got a deal less than the portion that was his by right." The man still returned his stare before giving a shrug.
"Mayhap his master had less need of the crop than the villagers who broke their backs sowing and reaping it for him, who gave up their time to work the fields in return for holding their own bit of poor land, for a man who lies abed all morning before rousing himself to ride out and watch them at work."
Thomas said nothing. After a moment, the other added,
"But then falconers ride along with the gentry and their ladies, and share their discourse and enjoy their favours. They have small need to bend their backs in toil. Is not so?"
Thomas opened his mouth to reply, but at that moment there was a sudden whirring of wings, and from little more than 20 feet away, a partridge that had been cowering in the stubble beside the path suddenly took flight. At once, Thomas loosed the jesses from the leash, raised his arm quickly, and watched as the mighty Tamora spread her wings and soared, following the flight of her quarry. In seconds, she had overtaken it and was hovering above the luckless bird, which flew this way and that before dropping to the ground in a futile attempt at concealment. Tamora, the tinkling of her bells audible even at this distance, dropped upon the partridge like a stone, then rose, holding the limp bird in her talons. Then she flew back to Thomas, dropped the catch at his feet, settled squarely upon his outstretched arm, and folded her wings. The whole business had lasted little more than a minute. "One for the supper table?" Thomas said quietly, as he picked up the bird. He glanced at the blond man, who was staring at the hawk. "I guess even falconers have their uses." To his surprise, the man grinned.
"Mayhap they do."
He came forward and stretched out his hand.
"Edward Birch, cottager of East Everley."
Thomas stowed the partridge in the pouch at his belt and took the man's hand, and at once regretted it. The other's fingers closed about his own in a grip of steel and held fast, tightening by slow degrees. He faced Edward Birch, trying to appear unperturbed for the falcon's sake. Tamora shifted slightly on his gauntlet. "If you wish to fight me, at least let me release the bird," he said, between his teeth. Birch's smile widened, but his grip tightened even further.
"Why would I want to fight you, falconer?" he inquired, innocently. "I won the wrestling bout between East and West Everley last harvest home. You think you could match me?"
"Then what is it you want from me?" Thomas asked, trying to ignore the pain in his hand, which worsened by the instant. Birch seemed to consider.
"I would venture I want you to forget you saw me in the fields this morning."
But the falcon, her senses highly tuned in the sharp morning air, had felt the tension in Thomas's arm through the gauntlet. Sharply, she turned her head and half raised a talon. Birch was wary. His glance strayed from the falconer to his bird, and Thomas saw his chance. Shifting his left arm slightly, as if about to release the falcon, he threw his right foot out, hooked it behind Birch's leg, and thrust him backwards with all his strength. With a look of surprise, Birch let go of Thomas's hand and toppled to the ground, sprawling on his backside. A faint wisp of chalk dust rose from the path. Thomas gazed down at him, breathing deeply. "My trouble is, I have too good a memory," he said. He glanced at his throbbing right hand, which was bright red, and worked the fingers, wincing at their soreness. Birch regarded him from the sitting position, then slowly got to his feet, dusting off his breeches. "One hitch to you," he muttered. Thomas felt for the small dagger at his belt. "You guessed aright that I'm no wrestler," he said. "You come at me, I'll spoil your hand." But Birch showed no sign of resuming the offensive. "Nay, Master Falconer," he said, with a half-smile, "I see you're no slouch either. I ask pardon for tweaking your fingers." Thomas eyed him warily. "No bones broken?" he allowed. Birch turned as if to go, then hesitated. "You reason well. The lammas strips along the edge of this field and the next, and still others hereabouts, belong to Sir Giles Buckeridge, a man who couldn't find the points to unlace his own breeches, who's ruined more good land than anyone I know with his foolish schemes." He broke off, as if feeling he was wasting his time. "But you do what you must. I will not deny what I did." Thomas gazed back at Birch and saw the plain courage in his face. One who would not plead for mercy, but stand his ground and take the consequences. "I'm a stranger here," Thomas said, after a moment. "Mayhap I don't know the fields so well as those that work them." Birch's eyes narrowed, but he remained silent. "And I have work of my own to do," Thomas added. "I'd best be about it." He took a step along the path towards the open downs beyond the fields. The other stood aside to let him pass. But he'd barely taken a dozen paces before Birch called after him. "If you come to East Everley of an evening, take a bite with me and mine, and I'll tell ye more tales of Chilbourne," he shouted. "Last cottage in the village, nearest the inn." Thomas gave a nod, which might have meant acceptance of the invitation, or merely consideration of it. Turning back, he strode uphill as the sun's warm rays broke across his shoulders. It was past dinner-time before he received his first instructions, with little enthusiasm. He was to take Gervase Lambert out to begin his falconry lessons. He stood in the long gallery which stretched along the entire south front of the great house. Dusty portraits of long-dead members of the Buckeridge family hung from the walls. There was little furniture, and only stale rushes on the floor. Neglect seemed to permeate every part of Chilbourne Manor. Sir Giles was looking somewhat harassed. "I know 'tis no easy task to lay upon you, Falconer," he mumbled, walking to and fro before the traceried windows. Thomas's gaze wandered outside to the figure of Nan Greenwood, who was spreading bed-sheets on the grass to dry. "I have strived to turn the laird into a gentleman. How else will he be fit to marry well? I mean, here in Wiltshire, where a man with no appetite for the chase is less than worthless." He cleared his throat. "God's heart and thighs! I despair at times. It's all anyone can do to tear him away from his books." Thomas managed a sympathetic smile. "I will do my best, sir. But I hold little hope of progress if Master Gervase has no liking for the sport." Sir Giles turned upon him with a pained expression. "Would that you and I might change places, Falconer. I would like nothing more than to spend my days tending hawks, rather than playing shepherd to a flock of daughters who flout my authority at every turn." He hesitated, like one who wishes to confide in another, yet is unsure of his ground. "A man with no sons, who's been dogged by a degree of ill luck, may find himself hard-pressed to provide dowries," he said, staring absently at the nearest portrait. "Which is why my eldest daughter Jane is betrothed to a man many years older than she." He paused, embarrassed by his own words, then went on more briskly. "My ward, Gervase, is an orphan, the son of one of my dearest friends, who died when the boy was scarce old enough to walk. I had in mind to make him the son I never had, to raise him a gentleman fit to marry into one of the great downland families."